I had a shotgun pointed at the sky, not at a person, not at an animal, at a drone. And yeah, I know how that sounds. Like something out of a bad headline or a viral clip with a comment section full of lawyers and keyboard warriors. But that morning, standing on my gravel driveway with the sun barely up and a machine buzzing over my barn like it owned the place, I wasn't thinking about optics. I was thinking, enough is enough. The thing dipped low again, maybe 20 feet above the roofline, hovering just long enough to make a point, like it wasn't just recording. It was watching, inspecting, judging, and on the other side of the fence, arms crossed, phone already up and filming, stood Melissa Crane, president of the Silver Creek HOA, self-appointed guardian of community standards, and, apparently, queen of land she didn't own. She yelled something about federal airspace laws, her voice sharp and rehearsed, like she'd practiced this argument in the mirror, and I just smiled, because the irony was thick enough to choke on. "Smile for the record, Daniel," she shouted. I waved. Then I pulled the trigger. The drone sparked, spun, and slammed into the side of my barn with a crunch that echoed across the pasture, a puff of smoke trailing behind it like a bad decision, finally catching up. Melissa screamed like I'd just committed a felony in broad daylight, and maybe in her mind I had, but in mine? That was just the first move in a fight she started 3 weeks earlier. And here's the part that sounds crazy. This whole mess didn't begin with the drone, or the shouting, or even the construction crew I found on my land. It started with a belief. Her belief. That I didn't matter. 3 weeks before that little aerial barbecue, I rolled out on my ATV toward the east fence line after noticing fresh tire tracks cutting across my hayfield. And there they were, 4 guys in reflective vests, clipboards out, measuring, marking, chatting like they were planning a backyard barbecue instead of stepping 20 feet into private property. I cut the engine, walked up, and asked what they were doing. One of them smiled, friendly, too friendly, and said, "Prepping for the solar grid expansion, sir. HOA initiative." I blinked. "Expansion, where exactly?" He pointed down. "At my land. Now, I've lived on that ranch my whole life. Well, technically inherited it, but every fence post, every ditch, every stubborn patch of dirt has a story attached to it, and I know those boundaries better than I know most people. So when I saw those little orange flags planted inside my property line, something didn't sit right. It didn't sit at all. I didn't argue. Not yet. I nodded, told them I'd be back, and drove straight to the Silver Creek HOA office, a place I technically didn't belong to, which is kind of the whole point here. See, my land sits right up against their development. Rows of identical houses, trimmed lawns like they're competing for a magazine cover, rules about mailbox colors and grass height. And for years, they'd been trying to clarify boundaries, which is a polite way of saying they wanted a piece of what wasn't theirs. Every time before, I shut it down. Paperwork, surveys, lawyers. But this time, this felt different. Bigger. Inside the office, Melissa greeted me like we were old friends, smile wide, posture perfect, the kind of energy that says she's already decided how this conversation ends. "Daniel," she said, "we were just about to reach out. We'll need your signature to finalize the energy sharing agreement." I didn't sit. "No." She blinked. "I'm sorry. No, you're not installing anything on my land. No, I'm not signing anything. And no, you didn't ask permission." Her smile tightened, just a little, like a crack in glass you only notice if you're looking for it. "I think you misunderstand," she said, voice dropping into that courtroom drama tone. "The board has approved use of adjacent unzoned land for community benefit. This is a sustainability initiative." I leaned on the desk. "That adjacent unzoned land has a deed, Melissa, and it's got my name on it." What followed was exactly what you'd expect. Emails, pamphlets, community posts. Hell, they even sent out a glossy brochure showing my east field covered in solar panels like it was already a done deal. Neighbors posing in front of land they didn't own, hashtags about green energy, comments about progress, and shared responsibility. At first, I laughed. I mean, you kind of have to, right? The audacity alone was almost impressive. But then the trucks showed up. Not survey trucks, construction trucks. Cement posts, wiring, trenching equipment. They didn't just talk about building, they started building. Inside my fence. That's when I stopped laughing. I called my attorney, Evelyn Harper, 70 if she's a day, sharper than anyone I've ever met. And we sent a cease and desist so clean it might as well have been framed, official, certified, impossible to ignore. Melissa ignored it anyway. Instead, she escalated. The drone started showing up every morning, hovering over the barn, dipping low over the livestock, lingering near the house just long enough to make it clear. This wasn't a hobby, it was surveillance. And when I finally checked their HOA Facebook group, yeah, burner account, I'm not proud, but I'm not stupid, I saw her posts. Monitoring safety hazards and encroachments. Encroachments. On my own land. That's when something shifted, not just anger, but clarity, because this wasn't about solar panels anymore. It wasn't about green energy or community benefit. This was about control. Melissa didn't see me as a neighbor or even a problem. She saw me as an obstacle, something to be managed, documented, eventually erased. And that drone buzzing over my roof. That was her way of reminding me. So yeah, I picked up the shotgun. And yeah, I pulled the trigger. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that she wasn't just crossing a line. She was walking straight into something my family had buried in that land almost a century ago. Something designed for exactly this kind of person. And the moment that drone hit my barn, that was the moment the trap started closing. Now let me pause right here for a second, because if you're listening to this thinking, there's no way an HOA can just walk onto someone else's land and start building. You're absolutely right. But also, not entirely. And that's where things get interesting. According to standard procedure, HOAs operate under a set of bylaws and covenants that only apply to properties within their jurisdiction, meaning if you don't live inside that community, they don't get to tell you what color your fence is. Or, install a solar grid on your ranch. But here's where people like Melissa start bending reality. From a legal perspective, there's something called adjacent use assumptions, not an official doctrine, but more of a gray area mindset where boards convince themselves that nearby undeveloped or rural land is flexible, especially if the owner isn't constantly present or pushing back. And once that belief sets in, it creates what I'd call a psychological trap. This is a psychological trap where authority becomes self-reinforcing. She had a title, a board, a group of residents backing her. So in her mind, that made her right, even when the law said otherwise, and the more no one stopped her early, the more confident she became. The lesson here is simple, but people miss it all the time. Just because someone acts like they have power doesn't mean they actually do. But if you let it slide long enough, they'll start believing it themselves. And Melissa? She didn't just believe it, she built on it. After that drone hit my barn and Melissa finished her little sidewalk performance about federal law, things got real quiet for about 12 hours, which, if you've ever dealt with someone like her, you know that silence isn't peace, it's planning. By the next morning, I had 2 calls waiting for me, one from the FAA, polite, curious, asking for footage, and one from Evelyn, my attorney, who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Daniel," she said, "stop reacting and start digging. Your grandfather didn't raise you to lose land to a homeowners committee." Now, that line stuck with me. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because of something my granddad used to say when I was a kid, usually after a long day fixing fences or clearing brush. If anyone ever tries to take what's yours, don't argue first, check the ground. At the time, I thought he meant stand your ground. Metaphorical. Turns out, he meant that literally. So I went out east, past the creek, past the section where those bright orange flags had started popping up like weeds, and I brought a metal detector, not because I knew what I was looking for, but because something in my gut said there was more buried out there than just old nails and rusted tools. It took about 40 minutes before I got a hit. Low, steady, not random, and when I started digging, I hit metal faster than I expected. Not scrap, not junk, a plate, cast iron, anchored in stone, edges worn but still solid, like it had been waiting, literally waiting, for someone to find it again. I brushed off the dirt, poured a little water from my canteen over it, wiped it clean with my sleeve, and when the lettering came into focus, I just stood there for a second, reading it twice to make sure my brain wasn't filling in blanks that weren't there. Dated 1924. Filed with the county. A private land covenant. And the part that made me laugh, like full-on laugh out loud in the middle of a field like a crazy person, was the clause. Any permanent or semi-permanent structure placed along the eastern boundary of the Callaway Ranch without written consent from the landowner would trigger immediate forfeiture rights, meaning the structure and the land beneath it could legally be claimed by the Callaway estate. I actually had to sit down, because suddenly, this wasn't a problem anymore. This was leverage. I called Evelyn right there, read the whole thing word for word, and she didn't even let me finish before saying, "Do not touch anything else. I'm on my way." She showed up an hour later with a magnifying glass, a legal pad, and the kind of grin you only see when someone realizes they're about to win before the game even starts. We cross-referenced the coordinates, checked the county records, dug through archives that probably hadn't been opened since before either of us were born, and there it was. Filed, stamped, active, never challenged, never revoked, still enforceable. Evelyn leaned back in her chair at the courthouse and said, "They didn't just trespass, Daniel, they triggered a mechanism." And that's when everything changed. We sent another letter, certified, detailed, impossible to misinterpret, laying out the covenant, the violation, and a very clear instruction to cease construction immediately or face full forfeiture proceedings. And I'll give Melissa this. She didn't ignore it because she didn't understand it. She ignored it because she thought she could outplay it. That week, they doubled down. More workers, more equipment, deeper trenches. They weren't just building anymore. They were committing. And I documented everything. Multiple cameras, timestamps, angles. I even strapped a GoPro to one of my goats. Don't ask, it made sense at the time, and let him wander the edge of the construction zone while chewing grass like he was part of the surveillance team. Best footage I've ever gotten. Meanwhile, the drone came back. Bigger this time. Louder. Hovering lower than before, dipping near the house, cutting across the pasture, like Melissa had decided intimidation was a strategy instead of a mistake. But this time, I didn't shoot it down. I waved, because now, I wanted the evidence. And oh, she delivered. Low-altitude flights, repeated passes over private areas, footage posted publicly on their HOA page with captions about monitoring compliance. It was like she was building my case for me in real time. The FAA called again, less curious now, more focused, and by the end of that conversation, it was clear Melissa wasn't just bending rules, she was breaking them. Badly. But the real turning point? The community meeting. Now, I almost didn't go. Figured my lawyer and the paperwork would handle things cleaner than a public argument. But something told me to show up, just in case Melissa decided to spin the narrative, and yeah, she didn't disappoint. The room was packed. Residents, board members, people who probably hadn't attended a meeting in years suddenly very interested in community progress. And there she was, standing at the front with her clipboard, posture straight, voice calm, like she still believed she was in control of this thing. "As many of you know," she began, "there's been some resistance to our solar initiative. Misinformation, legal confusion." I almost laughed right there. Legal confusion. She held up a copy of my cease and desist like it was evidence of sabotage, talked about obstruction, negativity, unwillingness to adapt, painted me like I was standing in the way of progress instead of standing on my own land. And that was the moment I stood up. Didn't plan it. Didn't rehearse anything. Just stood up. "Mind if I clear up that confusion?" I said. You could feel the room shift, conversations stopping, heads turning, phones coming out because people knew something was about to happen. Melissa hesitated, just for a second, then nodded, probably thinking she could handle it. I walked to the front, turned to face the room, and said, "This isn't about progress. It's about permission, and you didn't have it." I laid it out clean. The boundary, the construction, the ignored notices. Then I pulled out a copy of the covenant and held it up. "This document," I said, "was filed in 1924, and it states that any unauthorized construction on my eastern boundary becomes mine. Legally, completely, no exceptions." Silence. The kind of silence that makes people lean forward. "So let me translate that," I continued. "The solar grid you've been building isn't your project anymore. It's my property." Someone in the back said, "Wait, what?" Another voice, "Is that real?" Melissa tried to jump in, started talking about outdated documents, legal reviews, interpretation, words, lots of words, but none of them stuck, because the room had already shifted. You could see it in their faces. Doubt, concern, the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, their HOA had just walked them into something expensive. I stepped back, nodded, and went to sit down. Didn't need to say anything else, because the truth had already done the work. And from that point on, it unraveled fast. Within days, footage from the meeting hit social media, Residents started asking questions. Emails started flying. People who had been excited about free solar suddenly realizing they might be financially tied to a legal mess they didn't understand. The board turned on Melissa. Quietly at first, closed-door conversations, concerns about leadership, then publicly, when the pressure got too big to ignore. She tried to hold on, issued statements, blamed misinformation, talked about coordinated opposition, but it didn't stick, not when the facts were sitting in county records and FAA reports. And then came the final nail. A call from a county assessor. Casual tone, routine confirmation, until he mentioned a zoning adjustment request filed by the HOA claiming that section of land had been donated for communal use. Donated. I actually felt my stomach drop. Because that wasn't just overreach anymore. That was fraud. I asked him to repeat it, took notes, called Evelyn the second I hung up, and her response was simple. Now we go from defense to offense. The lawsuit we filed after that. It wasn't subtle. Trespass, property damage, forfeiture enforcement, fraudulent documentation, drone violations, civil penalties stacked on top of each other like a tower that was just waiting to collapse. And when the numbers came together, even I had to sit back for a second. Because this wasn't just about stopping them anymore. This was about consequences. And Melissa, she didn't see it coming. Not really. Because people like her don't think they're wrong. They think they're early. They think resistance is just a phase before acceptance. They think if they push hard enough, long enough, reality will eventually line up with their version of it. But reality doesn't bend like that. Law doesn't bend like that. And that century-old covenant? It didn't bend at all. By the time we got to court, the outcome was already leaning in one direction. Evidence stacked, documentation clean, timeline undeniable. And when Melissa tried to explain her decisions, tried to frame them as misunderstandings or miscommunications, it just didn't hold. Especially not when the drone footage came up. Especially not when the forged zoning claim was entered into record. The judge didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He just read, paused, asked a few questions, and then ruled. In my favor. Full enforcement of the covenant. Financial penalties. Revocation of her authority in any HOA governance capacity. And the part that still makes me shake my head a little. Ownership. That entire eastern installation, the panels, the trench work, the infrastructure, legally transferred to me. Just like that. And when I walked out of that courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. Not in the loud, celebratory way people imagine. It was quieter than that. Heavier. Because what really settled in wasn't that I had won. It was that she had never needed to lose this badly. All she had to do was ask. You know, the funny thing about all of this, it wasn't really about the land. Not in the way people think, because land, at least where I come from, isn't just dirt and fences and paperwork. It's memory, it's identity. It's something you inherit whether you want to or not. And what Melissa walked into wasn't just a legal boundary. It was a line that had been drawn long before either of us were born, a line backed by history, by intention, by someone in my family who clearly didn't trust people in positions of authority. And honestly, after all this, I get it. The lesson here is, power doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes it's loud, organized, backed by committees and newsletters and official titles. And sometimes it's quiet, buried under a few inches of dirt, waiting patiently for the right moment to matter again. And the mistake Melissa made, the big one, was assuming that visible power is the only kind that counts. From a legal perspective, what happened here is actually a textbook example of why due diligence exists in property law, because before you build anything, before you approve anything, before you even talk about expansion, you check ownership, you verify boundaries, you review recorded covenants, and not just the recent ones, not just the convenient ones, the entire chain. Because the law doesn't forget just because people get comfortable. But she didn't do that. And that's where the second layer comes in, the human one. This is a psychological trap, the kind where authority feeds on itself, where being in charge of a group makes you feel like you're in charge of reality, where every small success reinforces the belief that you're right, until eventually, you stop questioning your own assumptions altogether. And when that happens, you don't just make mistakes, you double down on them, you defend them, you build on them, literally in this case, until backing out feels impossible. Melissa wasn't stupid. That's the part people get wrong when they hear stories like this. They want a clear villain, someone reckless or careless. But she was organized. She was confident. She knew how to lead a room. What she didn't know was where her authority ended. And more importantly, she didn't want to know, because acknowledging that boundary would have meant giving up control. And control, once you get used to it, is a hard thing to let go of. According to standard procedure, HOA boards are supposed to act in the best interest of their members, which includes minimizing risk, not creating it. But when leadership shifts from service to ego, from governance to dominance, you start seeing decisions that prioritize image over reality, momentum over caution. And that's exactly what happened here. A project that probably started as a good idea, clean energy, community benefit, turned into a liability because no one stopped to ask the simplest question: do we actually have the right to do this? And here's the part one keep coming back to. All of this could have gone differently. If she had knocked on my door that first day, explained the plan, just asked, we probably would have figured something out. Maybe a lease, maybe a shared agreement, maybe even a partnership. I'm not against solar. I'm not against progress. I'm against being ignored, being overridden, being treated like a detail instead of a decision maker on my own land. That's what this was really about. Respect, or the lack of it. Because once that line gets crossed, once someone decides they don't need your permission, only your compliance, the conflict isn't about logistics anymore. It's about principle, and principle doesn't negotiate the same way convenience does. So yeah, I ended up with a new stretch of land, a working solar setup, and a story that's probably going to follow me around longer than I'd like. But if you strip all that away, what's left is something a lot simpler. Boundaries matter. Legal ones, obviously, but also personal ones, the kind you enforce not because you enjoy conflict, but because you understand what happens when you let things slide just this once, because just this once has a way of becoming precedent, and precedent has a way of becoming expectation. And once people expect access, influence, control, taking it back gets a lot harder than saying no in the first place. So if you're watching this and thinking, that would never happen to me, I'd just say, don't be so sure. Because most situations like this don't start with bulldozers and lawsuits. They start small, a conversation, an assumption, a line that gets nudged instead of respected, and whether it's an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone else operating with a little too much confidence and not enough clarity, the principle stays the same. Know what's yours. Know what protects it. And don't wait until someone else tests that boundary to figure it out. Because by then, you're already in the story.